So the question is redlining your car's engine damaging? Let's get into it now. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Mark with exoticcarplayplace. So before we get into the details about whether it's damaging to your engine or not, let's talk about the principle of what redlining your engine is. Now, every engine has a predetermined engine RPM, a rev limit that an engine was manufactured, designed for, based on interior design, construction, components. Diesel engines often don't need high revs. They don't need the horsepower because they're designed based on torque. Gasoline engines typically rev higher, but the internal components are designed in such a way to support specific redline applications. Now, cars like the car I'm in right now is a BMW 335. It has a redline of 7,000 RPM. And how do you know what the redline is? Well, if you look at the tachometer on your dash, it's the point at which you hit that line of red. And so that is the area that you ultimately want to try to avoid. If you're driving along and you're in automatic transmission, most automatic transmissions these days essentially will upshift for you automatically. You don't generally have to worry about it unless you put the car in neutral and floor it. If you floor the gas in neutral, even in an automatic transmission, it possibly will bounce off the rev limiter. Now, where it's a higher risk of hitting the red line is if you're driving either a DCT in full manual mode or a manual transmission is also a real possibility of hitting red line. Why? Well, mainly because you have full control. The car will not necessarily stop you. What will stop you, on the other hand, is the rev limit. Now, the rev limit is distinctively different than the red line itself. So often the rev limiter will cut you off either above the red line somewhere or at the red line, sometimes just shy of the red line. Usually it's into the red line zone. And so the rev limiter, what that does is generally cuts off fuel. Occasionally it'll cut off spark and slow the engine down. Now, if you drive a manual or a DCT in the way at which it was meant to be driven, rarely will you have a problem. There can be a problem though if, for in fact, say for example, you're trying to go for fourth and you hit second gear, that will spin your revs way beyond control. No longer do you have a load on the engine, you're really revving the engine, there's no control, and the actual rev limiter has no chance on cutting it off on time. This usually results in valve floating and piston valve collision, which essentially results in a catastrophic engine failure. A very, very bad situation. Another thing that can cause valves to float is revving it too high in the first place. If you have a really weak valve spring, in other words, if you have an engine that's not really designed for performance applications or race driving, often the soft valve springs will float too much even at a higher rev, even on a normal engine under normal driving conditions if you approach the red line. You want to prevent valve float. That's a bad condition because, again, anytime you float a valve is a chance on making collision between a valve and a piston head. As you rev your engine up higher, not just a red line, it's like rubbing your hands together. You feel that heat. There's a heat built up between your hands. But if you go slow like this, you'll notice there's no heat. So it's the same thing works in your engine. The faster you spin that engine, the more heat that's created. The more heat results in more friction, oil breakdown, and early deterioration of certain parts. Now, what parts can wear? Well, there's a lot of different parts that can wear under high rev applications. Again, I already spoke of valve springs can start to float a valve. Sometimes valves can actually break under really hard conditions, under very high rev conditions. Other things, for example, main bearings, rod bearings, wrist pins on your pistons and cylinder sets. Lots of different parts can take wear. Extra heat and wear and tear on your cylinder walls and your piston rings all see excessive amounts of heat because you don't have enough oiling between those points. The pistons are moving at such a rate that the oil does not any longer have enough lubrication to adequately protect your engine. So it just creates heat, friction, and wear the higher the revs you go. So then you ask the question, why would anybody drive a car to redline? Why wouldn't I just drive the car to 2,000 RPM? There's a few reasons why you want to rev your engine. Number one is performance driving, or maybe you need to pass a slower vehicle, or you need to get up to speed on a highway. you need to accelerate, and the revs need to come up to deliver the maximum horsepower of that engine. That will get you up to speed quick, fast, and in a hurry. So those are applications where you might have to consider revving your engine higher. Once you're done your pass or your hard acceleration to get up to speed, do you want to continue at that rev range? Generally not, because again, as I spoke, the higher the revs, the more heat, the more wear. And unless you have a real need to drive that car at a high speed, for example, racing applications, you may as well drop the RPMs down. For example, a lot of cars have overdrive. That does two things: reduce wear on the engine and fuel economy. So unless you're in a racing scenario or you're trying to pass a slower vehicle, there's generally no real need to run your engine up closer to redline. Now conversely, so why wouldn't I just rev up the car to 2,000 RPM and then shift, and then 2,000 and then shift? Because that's almost as bad for your engine. Putting excessive load on your engine at a very, very low RPM wreaks other negative effects on an engine, which we can speak to in another video. However, you do not want to under rev an engine, and you don't want to over rev it unless the application requires that. Now, how do you know if your car is one of those that's designed more for a race application and that can tolerate higher revs? Well, generally most manufacturers like Porsche in the 911s or Ferraris, Lamborghinis, they have dry sump engines. Cars that you know and historically have racing pedigree incorporated, often generally are designed to tolerate a lot of the higher revs. They too can see wear and tear, of course, but they'll generally often have doubled up valve springs, stiffer valve springs to prevent float. They'll have tougher internal components, camshafts that'll wear better. Everything will be designed, machined. Tolerances will accept higher revs much better than a pedestrian vehicle, for example, like a Toyota Corolla, which is designed for comfort, reliability, for low revs, longevity, but it's not meant for race applications. So the bottom line is, how do you know if you've ruined your engine if you've over revved it? The truth of the matter is, you don't. Either one of two things will happen. One, you rev your engine up to the red line and you hold it, and bang, catastrophic failure, and you'll know you wrecked your engine. The other thing that might happen is you run it up to the red line and you hold it for a while, and then you shift down and life is usual. The problem with that is you don't always know what damage has been done. Once you're running it close to the red, it wreaks havoc on the internals of the engine. It doesn't always mean a catastrophic failure, but what it does mean is accelerated wear. And accelerated wear and tear you don't always see. Sometimes it shows up 2-3 years later when all of a sudden you have a rod knock, or you're starting to consume more oil than you did previously. There's other things that can give off the hint that maybe the engine is starting to wear out. Redline doesn't do an engine any good, so use it selectively. Otherwise, there is a chance you might feel the dollars getting sucked out of your pockets by your mechanic. So everybody, I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you got something from this, be sure to give the channel a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'd really love to see you guys on the next one. Hope to see you then. Bye-bye.